Hello everyone, today we talk about the political and strategic background of the Waldensian involvement in the War of the Grande Alliance, or the War of the League of Augsburg, and practically the 9 Years' War, specifically between 1689-1690. We will talk more about specific armament and tactics of the Waldensians in this context that, as you understand, revolves mostly around France and Savoy, but with this broader international coordination in the League summoned against France. There are many references, and we will naturally, in fact, get much more in depth in other videos, but this can serve as a broader, in fact, introduction and compass for the rest of the content. There is also a previous chronological background that today we cannot digress on too much. When this thing should be studied a little bit with a map, but the essentials can be explained just general features of the territory. Starting from the fortress of Pinerolo, that at the end of the 17th century was the most important French stronghold along the southeastern border of the French dominion. Pinerolo's position to the east of the Alpine chain granted a solid bridgehead in the north of Italy, the main point d'appui of the Armée Royale towards Casale Monferrato, on the citadel of which, since 1681, the French flag waved. This Casale was a precious operational base that the French could use to dispute to Spain or Austria the control of the Italian territories. Here what the context would be, a couple of years later, the Habsburgs break the Ottoman Empire by defeating it at the siege of Vienna, so they swarm in Central Europe. And in a few decades, there's going to be, in fact, the Wars of Spanish Succession, with which fundamentally also Lombardy will pass from the Spanish to the Austrian control. So we are in the age of Prince Eugene. We are in this dramatic clash between, the Sun King, Le Roi Soleil, and the rest of Europe. It was coalesced against the hegemonic continental power. And as we'll see now, the religious element is crucial, and that's what the Waldensians came into place. Naturally, Pinerolo had not always been French, because it had been conquered to Savoy on March the 31st, 1630, by an army led by the same Cardinal de Richelieu, and acquired with the Treaty of Carrasco on April the 7th, 1631. And as most frontier areas, when you look at the border, you realize that this was a very complicated combination of course, first of all, fortresses in general, but naturally also of communities that supported them, and the broader relation between France and Savoy here was quite interesting. We can make soon a video about the strategic role of Savoy during, in fact, the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century in Europe, broadly meant. Some of you ask me, well, did you talk about Savoy? Well, we'll talk about Savoy at some point. We never did it so far. So the French essentially relied on this space as the main route. The one running along the Chisone Valley, at the opening of which, in the Piedmontese plain, Pinerolo was located. That's why this, of course, was so important. While the road between other localities such as Perosa Argentina, for example, and Pinerolo were incorporated by the French within an appendix, we can say, of territory that was delimited in the north by the watershed between the Chisone Valley and the Sangone Valley. and in the south by the same left bank of the Kisone River, which already tells you that, first of all, they didn't control the right bank, and that they relied still, however, on some kind of passes crossing between the two valleys in order to secure this position. That would have been vulnerable, in fact. But at that point, every kind of independent, let's say, enclave locally was eliminated politically. The French at that point were not threatened thus. The problem is that, however, war hadn't broken out yet. So in case of hostilities, as we will see at some point, this track was seriously compromised by, first of all, the salient, the Savoy salient of the Germanasca Valley, that was known at the time with the name of St. Martin's Valley, which was in fact inhabited in prevalence by Waldensian communities. They were known as the Barbetti at the time. And the Waldensians at this point, up to this point, had actually fought alongside the French, right, against Savoy. This was before, as we will see, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Savoy, just as France was a Catholic power, so the Waldensians were still heretics practically, and as we will see, there were ferocious, brutal, savage, vicious persecutions of the saints. People had been impaled, burned at stake. But I'm not talking about the Middle Ages. I'm talking about the 17th century even. Right, these people were drowned in the Canal Grande in Venice with stones tied to their necks. I mean, this kind of of cute temper of those times. And the French, of course, didn't give a damn about these people either, right? Just exploited them. But the Huguenots were still present, in fact, in France until the revocation of the Edict of Nantes that would have triggered the, in fact, as we'll see now, the glorieuse rentrée of the Waldensians, partly also in these areas. And before the political coordination we're going to see today internationally, with Savoy eventually, not openly supporting it up to a certain point, that Waldensians still, didn't do too much against their, eventually their anti-French action after the revocation of the Nantes Edict, represented in the salient of the Germanasca Valley a weak spot in the same Savoy defense. So up to that point, the French didn't mind the fact that their path between the major Italian assets in their control and France herself resulted completely exposed from the attacks of the Germanasca Valley. And even less, they keep caring about the fact that the roads that were fundamentally framed in a battle in which the French were in control just of the left part, were de facto undefendable, because they would have been exposed essentially by enemy fire from the right side, right? So just a few militia could actually keep them in check, right? And they're tough terrains. I'm uploading in this video some pictures of those places, and that gives you a fair idea what it looks like. So as soon as the international situation changed, the security of the same Pinerolo and of its connections with France came back powerfully on the fore. So as we were saying previously, on October the 18th, 1685, Louis XIV signed the Edict of Fontainebleau, which cancelled the Edict of Nantes of 1598, with which his grandfather, Henry IV of Bourbon, had granted the freedom of cult to the Huguenot that is, Protestant subjects in France. Louis pretended at this point an act of repression against the Waldensians, right, in the Pinerolo area, and finally of a true and proper military expedition aimed at their destruction. Consider that I made a video about the French dragonnade at the time, which we often mention, given that we talk about the development of modern armies and fundamentally the establishment of permanent forces, in fact stable barracks, exactly in a truly statal national sense in history from the time of the Sun King onwards. But this also was a gradual process in the same Louis' very long reign, and actually on this occasion, especially in fact the revocation of the Edict of Nantes from Fontainebleau, was the chance for many royal soldiers to be billeted in the Protestant communities of France that were thus spoiled, and this is basically the term dragonnade. It takes name after the dragoons, but generally speaking is referred to the fact that after Fontainebleau, the French soldier could do whatever the hell they wanted against these communities, and with the most vicious amount of violence and repression. And don't think, in fact, states at the time were ruled still in a very medieval fashion, right? France was just actually very much on the fore, very more advanced than other places, but this was effectively a specific religious discrimination, important field of choice. We don't have time to digress on the broader reasons brought Louis to issue the Edict of Fontainebleau, but that was part of a broader, major historical phase in European history. Many of the French Protestants emigrated in other countries, such as even Prussia, boosting also part of its manpower and labor force, and France did suffer because of this, in perspective, because these Protestants were also often very much involved in some of the most remunerative economical activities, etc. But it was a matter of orthodoxy, it was a matter of, in fact, monarchic absolutism, and the attempt to consolidate what, in fact, was becoming successfully the most powerful state in Europe, and by far, again, an hegemonic one against which all the rest of the continent had almost had to be allied with. And Savoy in this was a second-rank power in this context, but again, there were a few other powers really could compare with France, except this one was neighboring France. Just the Alps were, and not even, because most of the Savoy state at this point was effectively Piedmont, but the ancestral lands of Savoy are essentially Burgundian, but French, in the sense that France had incorporated southeastern, what we call today southeastern France. As a matter of fact, in a historical sense, we've seen it just recently, talking about the French re-expansion from the late Middle Ages onward. And the repression of the Waldensians naturally was an issue for the same, in fact, French in Italy, because they wanted to get rid of them there too. Generally speaking, the papacy cared about leaving war out of the peninsula. It had been at least a name, a successfully pursued one in the previous times. Say the country had suffered, especially with the plague of broke out coming from Central Europe during the 30 Years' War. The Spanish presence had been sensibly weakened. Let's say, in spite of the Austrian takeover, it's really French culture that spreads in Italy eventually as the most updated one, the most and without too much trace actually of the Spanish presence that hadn't been, contrarily what was mostly historiography thinks about, was not particularly oppressive. On the contrary, and there had been an important expansion before the plague, and both economically and demographically. Lombardy was well framed in also some important luxury production for the Spanish Empire and so on. But history takes different paths all the time, and so this was always an evolving situation. There were immediately clashes between bands of Waldensians, mostly guerrilla forces, and the French troops. And the Waldensians were not just in Piedmont, as we will see, they were in the same Dauphiné, in France, and in Switzerland as well. In fact, the Glorieuse Rentrée started from Geneva, as a matter of fact, but it was aimed at Piedmont and these specific areas. So you understand, it's a perfect storm in a frontier area, tough, say, alpine and pre-alpine terrain of a religious community with a deeply entrenched sense of themselves, of their identity, of their fate. They're determined to essentially get back in power in the area, so they have all the motivation against, again, a giant like France that, however, in the area has sensible difficulties, as we will see now. And this guerrilla, naturally things begin, they escalate eventually, but they begin with this kind of banditry, brigandage, but also start becoming more consistent. And that's when the French began to understand that this strategic corridor that united Pinerolo to France was pretty unsafe, too narrow. The Waldensians now had that damn salient from their side and a pretty good terrain advantage all along the valley that connected the stronghold to France. Now, the Duchy of Savoy, Victor Amadeus II, was dragged in this French, let's say, crusade because of the strong bonds that united his Protestant subjects of Piedmont to the Huguenots that were in fact just settled just across the Alps in the Dauphiné. The Waldensians, as we were saying before, were what remained of that medieval sect founded in 1160 by Peter Waldus. We have seen him in some video about the medieval heresies. They were condemned, in fact, as such, as heretics, and persecuted relentlessly. And in fact, this community was really all what remained in the Alpine valleys west of Turin. And without an external prompt, the Duke of Savoy would have likely not persecuted them, because after all, they had been up to that point quiet subjects that paid their due, and they didn't threaten public order. Well, this in part had been true for other Protestants, as they were persecuted somewhere else. In France, it was a much bigger national issue, but for Savoy, it was just like they didn't care so much. There was no major agitation or problem posed by them. And by the way, contingents of Waldensian militia had taken part to the recent campaigns against the same rebels of Mondovì in Piedmont that had risen against Savoy. So it was, generally speaking, a Waldensian obedience towards Savoy that was just being broken because of the insistency of naturally the French demands to Savoy to make more against the Waldensians to support the French troops in Piedmont. And initially, Victor Amadeus II, in fact, was immediately resistant to the demands of Louis the XIV, but eventually he was forced to personally lead the campaign in the spring of 1686 that actually brought to the extermination and deportation of almost all the Waldensians in Piedmont. This was a brutal thing, right? And it shows, of course, that they weren't much of a threat altogether. It could be removed. Not completely extirpated, but still some of them took refuge elsewhere. Now, from the first months of 1687, the Duke of Savoy began to assume ever more anti-French tones for broader reasons, not much for the Waldensians themselves, but for international reasons, quite powerful ones. So we are in the late 80s, and so the Austrian Empire has basically defeated the Turks and was reimposing itself as the European power opposed to France, right? We make lots of videos about most of the previous years, the ones before the siege of Vienna, and we've seen how complicated the whole situation was. The collapse of the Ottoman army really opened the Augsburgs to an enormous power, unprecedented power. This is the time of Prince Eugene of Savoy. In fact, it was a relative of the same duke and boasted an important descent from the Saint Charles I, even though fundamentally was an Italian French that had escaped the same court of Versailles, and Louis XIV was terrified because at some point it would become more, especially as Prince Eugene would associate with Marlborough in Flanders, by the fact of having let this, at the time, young, sickly kid away, right? And literally, as Eugene had wanted to be in the French army to receive a commission as an officer by Louis. And so there is a deep attrition here. Of course, the reactivation of Austrian power, as we were saying before, meant a greater involvement in Italy. That was, especially in the north, right? But not only, because there were wars fought in the same south. The same Savoy would become, in fact, as you know, the Kingdom of Sardinia because of the acquisition of the island. First, actually, they were given Sicily, but then they exchanged it with the Austrians. They got Sardinia, and that this is something perhaps we'll see another time. In any case, the mostly but not exclusively the Protestant nations had united in the aforementioned League of Augsburg, guided by William III of Orange, so the stadtholder of the United Provinces, that would in fact land in a couple of years in the same England and carrying out the so-called Glorious Revolution, and so ending the period of ambiguity of the Stuarts that, as you know, were essentially crypto Catholics, to say the least. So very important dynamics here. There is the takeoff of the same United Provinces, of the same England, right? This is the time in history where basically these nations surpass in per capita wealth even Italy historically. And so it's really another world that English and Dutch fleets that cooperate sometimes. They had been cooperating with the Venetians here, also with Savoy, depending on the situation. And Victor Amadeus, the month of February of 1687 in Venice, where he could negotiate personally with his cousins, in fact the Elector of Saxony, and the same Prince Eugene, right? In these contexts that were preemptively open, not just to check the terrain, but became in this situation, especially of Savoy, that was tried to be, in fact, it was controlled by France by a certain degree, to Piedmontese state, kind of more aware of his potential, and the context in this alliance, and the context became more assiduous and important. And in September 1688, where the war between France and the Augsburg League broke out, Savoy saw definitely new scenarios opening. The Duke was waiting for the good chance to free himself of this heavy French tutelage, while Louis XIV was instead contemporarily trying to maintain this wavering ally, faithful to him. Of course, it was a huge negotiation also from the French side. I mean, everybody knew, as always, what's going on in the world. We're just often not told, but states negotiate constantly about everything in the most ruthless ways. The problem for France was that her army was mostly committed, and very hardly, by the way, in Flanders. It was the major operational theater there, where most, in fact, Protestant nations would act, operationally, especially to support the Netherlands that were threatened by annihilation by the same France. And as a consequence, Louis XIV could not, at that point, exercise all his deterrence and potential on Savoy. The Allies' attentions, however, was concentrating at that point also towards the southern frontier of France. The Waldensians that had escaped in Geneva were always wishing to come back in their own valleys. They had attempted to penetrate Piedmont already in the summer of 1687 and in June 1688, and in February 1689, William III of Orange landed in England and seized steadily, by the way, the British throne. The Allied powers at that point saw in the Waldensians, and in their recent but also more ancient past, for the moral drive this could provide them, a very precious card to play against France. Their comeback would have given a strong signal to the Duke of Savoy, right? A signal that would have had to bring him definitely within the arms of the great European alliance against Louis XIV. So Piedmont was identified as a very interesting theater because it could really, it was an area where France was very vulnerable. After all, there was all the broader significance of the Alpine passes, and so the possibility of the ability of the French to enter Italy, to contend with the imperial power there. And objectively would have been a very heavy blow if that connection would have been severed, and plus Savoy could count on the support of the Dutch and English fleets in the Mediterranean, right? Consider that Savoy controlled not just Piedmont, but also Liguria, and so and the access to the Mediterranean. And the French, as you know, had been quite active in fact, also the Mediterranean would be able to pressure with their navy some important choke points. Think about, the siege of Messina that occurred at some point. So these are all things that we had, the bombing of Genoa, for example, and other issues. So a presence of an army made up of an important amount of Protestant troops could have also unleashed some revolts and unrest in the Dauphiné and in the Cevennes that were areas inhabited by French subjects that had been forcibly converted to Catholicism. So it's obvious that a power like this broader alliance that, also the Augsburgs were with the Protestants in this sense, right? Things change. The French had supported the Ottomans against, even though they were a Catholic power. So as you know, after the 30 Years' War, much of the religious axis kind of doesn't have at least the same meaning that it had before. Not that before, everything was actually dictated by that. I mean, just think about what the French did during the 30 Years' War, that is to say, creating literally the Swedish army. So the point was that Protestant powers like, in fact, the Netherlands, England, etc., in their coming back, especially think about what happened in Britain, as we just said with the Glorious Revolution, were giving hope to these populations of some coming back of their own Protestant side, even in areas where they had somewhat given hope to be able to survive, especially in Southern Europe. And these revolts in France, by the way, could have literally posed severe problems to Louis XIV. So to pressure him, to create the necessary preconditions to oblige him to negotiate at that point. The Waldensians were provided with money, weapons, and the training necessary to succeed in the enterprise. Victor Amadeus II, that was in need of this Waldensian coming back, so to actually receive the same allied support to Savoy as well, was willing to accept this plan and action. So in the night between August the 26th and 27th, 1689, a band of almost 1,000 Waldensian and Huguenot refugees, commanded by the priest Henri Arnaud, left Geneva for an epic march that would have passed down to history with the name of the Glorieuse Rentrée, that is to say, the glorious coming back. And these men managed to surpass without incidents with the French the Montcenisio. They defeated actually a French unit that blocked their passage to the bridge of Saint-Bertrand in the Susa Valley, and at the rhythm of forced marches on September the 6th, they managed to get back to their native valleys. Here, they carried out a viciously brutal repression. Right, they sacked the houses of the new colonists that had been settled to displace their legacy, their memory. They held ambushes to the patrols, and they spread terror fundamentally all around. And so consider even, again, what this means. These people had been consistently butchered in the most horrifying ways for centuries, and also recently. So, and they had been dispossessed from their houses. They were literally fighting for reaffirming in an equally brutal way their own rights, and profiting of the momentary French military weakness, because all the might of France was basically concentrated in Flanders at that point, and also of the actually the complacent lack of Savoy, repression, because they were actually with the same duke. Arnaud and his men had succeeded in an enterprise that, albeit relatively modest, in a sense, in a confined way, in a small scale way, however had a massive moral impact all over Europe. And in Versailles, such attack had not been foreseen. It deeply surprised and also worried Louis XIV. A group of armed Protestant rebels in the Dauphiné could have easily fueled a revolt among the consistent local Huguenot population, and throughout all the summer 1689, the French Protestants had, in fact, been in this, kind of trepidant wait of expectation of an allied invasion at some point. The coming back of the Waldensians risked to be the spark that could have ignited this inflammable mass. And in the following winter, some bands coming from the valleys, in fact, did cross the mountains. They entered the Dauphiné, sacking and destroying some small border centers, settlements. It was thus crucial that the Waldensian sanctuary of the Pellice and Germanasca valleys was immediately eliminated before the rebels could endanger the security of the southeastern borders and the communications with Pinerolo, again, the most important stronghold, to connect, especially with the rest, with Montferrat, etc. And this was also the point of crucial importance, given the wavering fealty of Victor Amadeus to France, given that Piedmont hadn't still made its move, and the French counted still on their deterrence to keep Savoy from, if not actively from their side, but at least neutral in that situation. Considered that all this glorieuse rentrée had actually been carried out within Piedmontese territory, and so the Savoy hadn't done basically anything to obstacle it. And consequently, Louis XIV requested the assistance of the Duke of Savoy to defeat the same Waldensians. Initially, Victor Amadeus II, that truly was in a difficult situation, seemed to be ready to cooperate, and in fact a Savoy detachment guided by the Count of Parella began to rake the Lucerna and Pellice valleys, pushing the men of Arnaud towards the stronghold of Balsiglia, where the Waldensians fortified themselves, awaiting for winter, and so what was normally the end of the military season of the operations, where troops came to at least winter barracks, maybe closed but still not particularly active. The scarce combativity of the Waldensians in this situation, and the scarce determination demonstrated by Savoy, together with the continuous secret negotiations between the two sides, made these operations pretty bloodless. Right? Savoy and the Waldensians didn't want to fight against each other. So at the end of November, by the way, there were heavy snows, properly putting an end to every action in that operational theater. This helped the two sides a little bit in front of France. And throughout all the winter 1689-1690, the contacts between Victor Amadeus II and the allies of the League of Augsburg intensified. because the next season they would have had to go more openly at war. The Duke was seeking the support of William III of Orange, because now there was not much else that he could do to hide his position. It was either with the League or with France, right? So the Glorieuse Rentrée, from one side, had offered the Duke of Savoy a diplomatic opportunity in opening with the Allies, but on the other side, it had rather compromised already his relation with Louis XIV, that had seen at least Savoy not really taking decisive action against the rebels. So a single wrong step could have provoked an immediate French reprisal, the invasion of Piedmont. Time, however, was passing, and the Duke had not still, negotiated satisfactorily with the Allies themselves, exactly because what needed to be done in practice afterwards, and this was crucial really for everyone involved, and still. Also, in fact, the Allied cause had not been completely gained by Savoy, which was also militarily weak fundamentally. It was threatened specifically, when we talk about the French reprisal, by the army of Nicolas Catinat that was lodged in Pinerolo, and could have at that point obliged the Duke to renegade the same agreements with the Allies, right? It was a very powerful deterrent. Catinat was one of the most famous generals of Louis XIV, and was a consistent force there, was properly designed to keep Savoy, at bay. So the final decision would have depended on the development of the events, as we will see. Fortunately for the Duke, the primary objective of Catinat at that point were the same Waldensians at Balsillia, and it was an important stronghold, from where again all around was a general interesting, very complex theater and terrain that could be exploited by the rebels. So the French were wary as well. Only after having secured his own rare communication routes, Catinat could have been free to move against the Duke of Savoy. So the Waldensians came to play a dramatic role in this, because on them depended also the same French employability against Piedmont. So it really depended on how much the Waldensians could resist, essentially blocking the French in combat, this ferocious guerrilla, and thus also giving time to the Duke of Savoy to reach a satisfactory agreement with the Allies. And we will talk again about this and how it unfolded. There are some interesting battles were fought, for example, at the Granges of St. James in the Susa Valley. There are interesting informations about the Waldensian bands. All right, consider that there were basically not even 1,000 men, but their equipment is known. There are also the instructions of Janavel, that together with Arnaud was this other, officer that had had led the expedition. And the guerrilla tactics, the fortifications, the same men of Catinat are very interesting. So I'm not going to tell you how it would end, but we will hopefully make videos about this and continue a bit with this story. We will keep also talking naturally about lots of other things concerning modern warfare that I hope to intensify a little bit, as I told you. recently. This is part of it, in fact. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.